we have a very full day, and so to set the scene for the day and for the brand new chancellor of the DC Public Schools, we have one more question for all of you in the audience, and that is this. How would you rate the public school system where you live? Your options are excellent, good, needs help, or not sure. Some of you are changing your minds as I watch. So that's pretty telling. 7% say excellent, and 63% say needs help. Also a good backdrop for our next conversation. And for that, it is my pleasure to introduce the new Chancellor of DC Public Schools, Dr. Lewis Ferebee. Before coming to Washington in December, Dr. Ferebee spent 5 years as the superintendent of Indianapolis Public Schools. Welcome, Dr. Ferebee.
Thank you.
And here to lead the conversation is my colleague, Atlantic Senior Editor, Ron Brownstein. Ron, the floor is yours.
Good morning. Good morning, Mr. Chancellor. So how would you have answered that question about the DC public schools?
Oh, it's excellent. Excellent. No, seriously, I understand that it's immense responsibility and accountability on the public school system. And I think sometimes the expectations are a little bit unrealistic. But we still have a job to do, and we have very, very dedicated and committed educators here in DC Public Schools.
You know, like many cities, DC had declining enrollment in its public school system in the early part of the century till about 2008. It's been growing since, and there are projections that it could grow substantially over the next decade, perhaps by 15,000 more students or so. Is the system ready for that kind of growth?
Yeah, we're preparing for that type of growth. I think what's interesting, a lot of cities have decided, as we have in DC, that there's a big investment need to be made in early childhood education. We're really thrilled that almost 90% of our 4-year-olds have experience in a DC public school going to kindergarten. But we were able to do that by utilizing some of the space that we had as a result of some of the students moving out to the burbs. As more students are moving into the city, we're having to think about how do we build space. In an urban setting like DC, it's difficult to build space. And so how we do that, how we plan for the future is what we're thinking about right now.
The growth in the student body is largely in the more affluent areas of the city, and your excess capacity is mostly in more lower income or lower to middle income areas of the city. How do you solve that mismatch?
Well, for DC, it's interesting how you define low income and wealth is evolving.
Yeah,
so
right.
I think where you would point to as a community that is not of wealth, it's probably different today. What we do know, though, there are communities that are growing and families are flocking to those areas. We interestingly have a choice system where students can pretty much choose schools across the district. We do know where there are safety concerns, students are less likely to choose those schools.
So, you know, this ties into one of the biggest issues now facing the school system. Many of the schools where students have the greatest need are also those that have been losing enrollment, which results in them losing funding that is tied to per student formulas. I mean, it's not a newsflash to tell you that there are people in the city who believe that result is inequitable and even kind of perverse. One of the representatives on the DC State Board of Education for Ward 8 said, "Enough is enough of the disinvestment in the kids who need it the most." What's your response to the concern about that kind of reinforcing loop of less students, less resources?
Yeah, so we have decided that we want to use our resources more strategically. And I would respond by saying that we have given resources to schools that have had decline in enrollment, and we haven't seen outcomes as a result of those types of investments. And so we've decided that we're going to lean in different ways. We've decided that, for example, our extended school year model was not producing strong outcomes. We had students going to school additional days, and we were not seeing dramatic improvement in student achievement. We're going in different directions. there are other investments that we're making in those schools, but we're really intentional about how we utilize those
So when you
resources.
say that more investment in schools that were losing enrollment hadn't kind of reversed the cycle and you want to lean in a different way, what are the different ways that you can lean in and effectively serve those students who are remaining in those schools?
So I'll give you two examples. So historically, if you look at schools that have had declining enrollment and we've provided additional resources to those schools, they primarily bought people. And so in many cases, you have staff on top of staff with redundant responsibilities and not able to really touch students in a way that's meaningful and productive. We've decided, for example, we're investing in what we call our Connected Schools model, which is a team of individuals that would broker support for housing, healthcare, other needs that students and families may have, school-based mental health supports, healthcare supports for students in the school. And so one-stop shopping of resources and our ability to give families and students what they need is how we're thinking about making those investments.
The city participates, it's one of the cities that participates in the Partnership for Assessment of Readiness for College and Careers test. And you have seen, the good news is that you have seen steady gains across the system in the last several years, but you are still looking at very large gaps on this test, as you know, between white and Asian students on the one hand and African American and Latino students on the other hand. There's a 60-point gap between whites and African American students on English, a 63-point gap on math. Can you talk about both sides of that equation? Why are you seeing improvement overall, and even within groups, but why, and at the same time, the gaps are persisting and even widening? Why are both things happening?
So for us, again, like I said earlier, we've had a tremendous investment in early childhood education. And as a result, we're starting to see really strong performance at the elementary level as more students have had that experience. Not so much at middle grades and high school.
So it's not lasting in that sense.
Well, we haven't had those cohorts of students go through. So we've been in the game.
You have 10 years.
About 10 years.
Yeah.
And so the bulk of those students are still in elementary grades, some transition to middle school. And actually, over the last 2 years, we saw a bump in middle school performance. So we anticipate as those students matriculate up in middle school and high school, we'll continue to see those results. But we have to be truthful about our income gap. And like most cities, when you have a big income gap, you see that play out in student outcomes on standardized tests.
You know, I was going to say, we go to a lot of different cities for a lot of different events and about education and economic opportunity. And I've often felt that if there's one number in any city you go to that helps you best understand the school system, it's the share of students in each racial group that attend schools of concentrated poverty. Right? I mean, and the contrasts there are often enormous. PolicyLink, which is the group based in Oakland, in their latest data, 73% of African American and 66% of Latino students in DC attend high poverty schools, defined as schools where at least 3/4 of their classmates qualify for reduced or free federal lunch. By contrast, 70% of the white students attend low poverty schools, where only 1/4 or less of the students qualify for free or reduced price lunch. When you are dealing with that level of economic stratification and separation and segregation, how far can schools go in closing the achievement gap if that is the underlying economic distance or chasm that you're dealing with?
So we all know that students perform best when there's greater diversity by race and socioeconomics. However, as a principal of a school where over 90% of the students were students of color and student poverty, and we outperform the district average, we know it can be done. And so I think there's a twofold approach to how you address that. One, ensure that there's a high quality school at every grade level in every community, but also ensuring that families have choice and if there are particular school models that they're interested in or particular options for career pathways, that they have access to it and are able to make those choices when they see that it meets the needs of their child.
You know, I'm struck. I checked on the PolicyLink data that in Indianapolis, where you came from immediately before this, the gaps weren't nearly that big. In Indianapolis, it was about 45% of African American, 48% of Latino, and 24% of white students attended high poverty schools. So you didn't have this overwhelming, you didn't have the gap to the same extent that it's present in DC. Are the underlying housing and kind of residential patterns here, does it make it tougher to achieve equitable school opportunity for kids than what you dealt with before?
Absolutely. Like I said, I mean, this is one of the largest income gaps in the nation. And affordable housing is a part of our conversation daily. It's reflected in the mayor's budget. It's part of our priorities, ensuring that we, one, have a place for people to live. They're not thinking about housing, where they're going to live each day, but also thinking about housing and the connection to housing in our public school options.
You know, I mentioned the test, the Partnership for Assessment of Readiness for Colleges and Careers test. And we talked about the gaps system-wide based on racial background. When you look at the school level, the gaps are the individual schools which you publish, or your office publishes. The gaps in some ways are even more astounding. On English language, Deal Middle School in Northwest had 76% of its students score in the top 2 levels on English. Hart and Henley Middle Schools in Southeast had 6%. In March Brent Elementary School, I think it's Capitol Hill, and Hearst Elementary School in Northwest, they had about 2/3 of their students in the top 2 percentiles. Sousa Middle School had 1%. How do you, I mean, from the point of view of assuring students, you know, the goal is to give every student a chance. Can the city say that it is, in fact, giving every student an opportunity when you're dealing with gaps of that magnitude?
Well, obviously, there's more that we need to do. And we've decided that we need to dance longer and earlier with our students that are furthest away from opportunity. So, for example, we talked about our 4-year-olds. We're now reaching out to our 3-year-olds. And in a number of those communities that you referenced, we're starting to serve them as early as age 3, in some cases age 2 or age 1. All of that being done on a public school campus. And so just at an elementary school yesterday, C.W. Harris Elementary School, parents dropping off a 1-year-old, a 3-year-old, a 7-year-old, and a 9-year-old. And those are the types of experience that we are creating in those communities to ensure, again, that we're dancing with our students furthest from opportunity, earlier and longer. When I say longer, beyond high school, ensuring that there's post-secondary persistence as well.
I should mention to the audience that we're doing the questions through the Slido system, so if you want to grab your phones and type in a question. We'll be taking them in a couple minutes, and we will not be offended up here if you're typing away to get your question. You know, we've talked a couple times. There's obviously a lot of interest in a lot of different cities about expanding access to preschool. New York City has put a lot of money into it. San Antonio under the Julian Castro, Seattle, Denver, Chicago. But DC was one of the earliest and has one of the biggest, most robust, and most highly rated programs. What have you learned? What has the city learned and obviously there are Democrats who want to take this nationwide. Universal pre-K at 3 and 4. What have you learned in 10 years of doing this?
It's definitely a way to grow enrollment. And so we've seen families who choose our early childhood education settings, then choose the elementary school where they've attended preschool, and then those families are more likely to stay with us. We also seen that it's an attractive option for the housing market. I mean, you think about what a family would pay couple $1,000s a month in childcare and not having to pay that expense and relying on the public school system to be the solution.
Yeah.
Can really bolster the economy for the community. And then knowing that students are coming to kindergarten with the prerequisite skills to be successful with early literacy, which we know is so critical to student success. I can't think of a better strategy and investment, and we're starting to see that again pay off in some of our results.
By the way, in the questions, please put your name, include your name and your identification. DC, another. I'm just doing what I was told. Another thing that DC was early on was trying to tie teacher compensation to student outcomes with the impact system, as well as going to short-term contracts for principals, which has been another way of kind of moving in that direction. What have you learned from? What has the city learned from those experiences?
Well, with teacher performance pay, as you can imagine, any performance pay system ramps up competition. And there are perceived winners and losers because you're talking about pretty hefty teacher bonuses in DC up to like $20,000. And so when we have teachers who meet the mark, excited, yay, and then sometimes when teachers don't meet the mark to earn that compensation, there's some concern, and oftentimes we hear complaints about why that teacher was eligible or not. And so I think controlling for fairness and consistency is important. On the principal side, I lean towards longer contracts
You do.
for our principals, especially those principals who have been with us for a while and have proven to be effective in their work.
Yeah. Let's see. We got our first question. Anonymous. Good at following instructions. How would you address the high levels of stress that DCPS's focus on standardized tests create in the student body? A common question for superintendents everywhere.
Yeah, I mean, it is a common question. I think we have the added element of the performance pay that is tied to standardized tests. And so with that, there's, even increased pressure, I think, for a lot of teachers. I think the best thing that we can do is acknowledge it, call it out, and ensure that, as we're thinking about mental health for our students, we need to be thoughtful about mental health of our educators as well. And so I think about, schools that have invested in yoga. Is that something that our teachers need to be a part of their day as well? And so I think caring for our educators, acknowledging that it is high stakes, there's a lot of pressure and stress, and giving them the appropriate outlets to relieve that stress will be effective.
Kind of a related question in some ways. Again, anonymous, but as a DC public school teacher, I see a lack of qualified teachers and a lack of research-based practices used in PDs and policy. How can this be addressed to improve DCPS?
Yeah, I would like to learn more. I mean, from what I've seen, a lot of the professional development is led by our own staff. I love to see more professional development led by our teachers. I'm a huge fan of teacher leadership. I believe that teachers learn best from each other, and to teach is also to learn. And so we'd love to learn more about what teachers have experienced in the district in terms of professional development, and then infuse more opportunities for teachers to lead the development. I believe we have enough talent in the district to develop our educators for success. What I do worry about is our beginning teachers. I do hear often that the appropriate supports and mentoring for our beginning teachers is not there or what it should be.
I was going to ask you a question about charter schools, but we've got one from the audience, from Renee, Ward 5 resident. Please discuss DC's approach to the siphoning of DC resident tax dollars to charter schools with high enrollment from students who are not district residents.
Yeah, so we have a common enrollment system that monitors how students are enrolled, where they come from. And so I think if there are concerns about students, I think the question is outside of the district.
Yeah, I think that's what it means, yeah.
That needs to be investigated because we want to ensure that our public dollars here in the district are supporting students that are living here in the district.
There is legislation from one of the council members, Charles Allen, to bring DC charter schools under the same transparency requirements as the traditional public schools. Have you expressed an opinion on that legislation?
I haven't. I don't spend a lot of time thinking about work outside of DCPS. However, I will say that we have our own work to do around transparency. We have made a commitment to ensuring that how resources are allocated to schools are much more transparent. Because families can't track dollars to schools and dollars to students, there's a lot of misperceptions around equity in the district, and I think we have our own work to do as relates to transparency with funding.
Let me do one more from the audience, and I have one final question for you. Do you believe that active shooter drills are enough to protect students? What else is being done in the school system to prevent gun violence?
It's interesting. We actually have a safety summit today. I'm going to leave here, and we are partnered with other agencies in having constant conversation around school safety. The challenge is you always want to get better with safety, and having strong relationships, I believe, with students to gain intel when potential incidents are going to occur is one proactive approach I've seen be effective. But secondly, thinking about our procedures, our drills, we have very strong wanding in schools before students enter into the building. We have security across many of our campuses, secure vestibules, but we are always thinking about how we get better to protect our students and our staff, not just when they're in school, but also to and from school. We have a strategy we call Safe Passage. Is designed to ensure students have a safe passage from home to school. We need to continue to build that out in our communities where safety is a concern.
Let me ask you finally, you're fairly new in this role. I'm wondering, do you have goals that you define success to yourself by? I mean, how will you define whether you are successful in this position?
Yeah, so for me, my North Star has always been, will continue to be, can students earn a livable wage when they leave DCPS? You know, the mayor and I, we often talk about every student having a fair shot and a way into the middle class or higher. And when students turn the tassel on graduation day in a couple weeks in June, it's my expectation that they're prepared for college or career. And I think that's how we should all measure success. And it requires collective responsibility to do that well.
Mr. Chancellor, thank you for joining us this
Thank
morning.
you, sir.